Let me start simply. The Soviet Union was an abject improvement on Tsarist Russia. I will be judging both nations using the criteria set out by Michael Parenti in his famous speech, U.S. Interventionism, the Third World, and the USSR.
So you can judge a socialist country, one, by what it's replacing. Two, you can judge it by comparing it to U.S. society. And three, you can judge a socialist country by an abstract model of what you might ultimately want. By the way, that's...
I'll be talking about two revolutions that occurred in Russia in quick succession. First, the Revolution of 1905, and second, the Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War that followed. When people refer to the Russian Revolution, they are referring to the Revolution of 1917. I will always refer to the Revolution of 1905 as the Revolution of 1905. The Revolution of 1917, on the other hand, I will often refer to as just the Revolution. This out of the way, let us discuss the Tsars. The last Tsar was Tsar Nicholas II. He was neither a villain nor a saint. He was a terrible ruler, but most of his failings were due to incompetence and not malice. His inauguration is a great example of this. He promised free bread and beer to the Russian peasantry, and the starving peasantry responded in kind. Yet, when rumors started that there would not be enough bread or beer, people stampeded, and there were many injured and dead. The Tsar at first went to visit the dead and dying, but was quickly whisked off by his advisors to a French party. His lack of care for the peasantry continued in 1891, when the famine of 1891 was caused by his continued export of food during a food shortage. 1905 would display the Tsar's utter incompetence as a wartime leader during the Russo-Japanese War. Under his leadership, Russia would be the first European power to lose to an Asian power. And in fact, the revolution of 1905 would be started on the decks of the warships in that war. The primarily enlisted sailors would rise up against the royal officers and take the ships. After the sailors' riots, soon the revolution would spread to the rest of Russia. Once more, we must pause our story to make a distinction. There are two distinct Soviets we will refer to in this story. The original Soviets were formed in the chaos of the revolution of 1905 by farmers, workers, and soldiers who wanted councils to be able to represent them. These original Soviets would be dismantled by the Tsar after the revolution failed. But this does not mean that the revolution did not bring any democracy. The Tsar would make some concessions, as he formed a parliamentary system and a constitution. The parliamentary system was called the Duma. The Duma were not elected by the majority, but a minority in Russia who had the right to vote. The Duma were also often overruled or ignored by the Tsar, and as such had very little power in Russia. Turning away from the Tsar and his Duma, let us look at the Russian people. At the bottom were the workers and peasants. The peasants who worked land that they did not own, and the workers who worked in factories they did not own. These people made up the majority of the Russian populace. The farmers were mostly made up of the children and grandchildren of serfs. While serfdom was abolished under Tsar Nicholas's grandfather, the systems that oppressed people and kept the land in the hands of noble rulers were not abolished. As such, most of the Russian land was owned by a wealthy elite, and the people who worked it would see very little of the profits made on that land. The city was not any better. The workers who worked in factories or dockyards would experience brutal conditions with very little safety regulation. Most bosses seeing it as cheaper to just replace a dead worker than to engage in any safety practices that may lose them cents or dollars. These miserable lives would not be improved by the minor consolations that the Tsar gave after the revolution of 1905. The Duma would not help these people, and the Constitution would not give these people rights. So, left with little other option, the people turned to alternative systems. Here I will read you the chorus of the Bolsheviks. All power to the Soviets. All power to the direct representatives of millions on millions of common workers, soldiers, peasants. Land, bread, an end to senseless war, an end to secret diplomacy, speculation, treachery. The revolution is in danger, and with it the cause of people all over the world. It was these Bolsheviks who would unite many people under the communist banner, leading them to a victory in the Revolution of 1917 and the establishment of the Soviet Union. The Revolution of 1917 would start on February 23rd, International Women's Day in Russia, and would continue until March 3rd, 1918. It was once again started by a war and the Tsar's incompetence within that war, in this case World War I. Unluckily for the Tsar, this revolution was much stronger and more well-organized than the Revolution of 1905, and neither he nor the Duma could unite or take power. The Soviets, among many other factions, would emerge victorious after the civil war that followed. Now we shall discuss their government. Let us first start with its constitution. Much like the Tsar's constitutions they replaced, the Soviet constitutions would give many rights. Unfortunately, many of these rights would be ignored or undermined by the Soviet government. On screen will be articles from the Constitution of 1936. These articles represent the early Soviet ideology quite well, and we will be exploring them in more depth in later sections. Many of the articles I've shown you are highly progressive, but as stated above, many would also be undermined or ignored under the rulership of Stalin. Stalin would reform the secret police and would often prosecute without true trial many people he decided were state enemies. These secret police would be instrumental in the Stalinist purges of the early Soviet Union. These purges would mar the Soviet Union and are not comparable to anything done by the Tsars. The purges were brutal but deemed necessary to remove state actors who were deemed to be anti-Soviet or anti-communist. Much like the McCarthy purges of America, evidence was often dubious, and the crime could be as simple as Stalin not liking you, though in fact these purges were far more brutal than anything committed by the McCarthy-era American government. As such, these purges represent the first horrific crime of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, like all nations, has many crimes, and we will be highlighting some here. But even with these crimes, I still maintain that the Soviet Union was better than the Tsardom. The early Soviet Union will often be praised for its feminist agenda, though its first constitutions in fact did not even mention women. This was rectified in the Constitution of 1936, in which women were equal to men completely under the law, guaranteed equal pay, the right to vote, and to be elected. The Soviet Union would also offer full maternity leave and pay during that period, and some paternity leave and paternity pay. Because of this, it is easy to see that women's lives in the Soviet Union were better than those under the Tsar, and they had more rights than those in the US. The 5-year plans of the Soviet Union are not comparable to anything under the Tsar. As such, we must compare them to the most comparable thing in US society, this being the New Deal policies and projects of the US. While both policies and projects from the US New Deal and the 5-year plans of the Soviet Union were meant to provide jobs and electrify the nation during the Great Depression, the Soviet plans had another goal. This goal is best stated by Stalin in his speech at the first All-Union Conference. "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall go under." And under the 5-year system he would. Even critics of the Soviet Union must admit the immensely impressive industrial leap performed by the early Soviet Union. In the first 5-year plans, they would take a backwards feudal state and make it into an industrial power that could rival even the United States. The gulags were prisons in the USSR. They were started under Lenin and perfected by Stalin. Much like many prisons in the US, they would use forced prison labor to produce goods and commerce for the Soviet people. There is a common misconception that the gulags were only for those who spoke out against the Soviet government. This is incorrect. The gulags were a general prison system in the USSR and held many prisoners, from common thieves to murderers. I say this not in defense of the gulags, but to show the gulags in full. The gulag system would end in 1960, but that is far after our tale ends. But how did the gulags compare to the prisons and systems to deal with political prisoners under the Tsar? The Tsar had no gulags, yes, but the Tsar had something far better: Siberia. If you were a political prisoner under the Tsar, he would just ship you to Siberia or kill you. On the other hand, though not mentioned in this system, the Soviet Union would also just kill you. So, really, not much had changed here. The Soviet Union, though it had its gulags, and the Tsar, though he had his Siberia, were very similar. And as such, this represents another great fault of the Soviet Union. They had not solved the system of oppression used by the Tsarist government against political prisoners and general criminals, and the gulags would stay in Russia until 1960 when they were ended. Before we discuss the famines of the Soviet Union, I would like to remind you of the famine of 1891 caused by the Tsar. The Tsar, during a food shortage, continued exports of food, including increases to exports of food, which led to a famine and mass death. Keeping this in mind, now let us talk about the famines of 1921, 1932, and 1946. The famine of 1921 was caused by a terrible crop failure in the Volga Basin. This famine was relieved when the Soviets opened up trade with the West and received aid from the United States. The famine of 1946 was caused by losses of World War II. The country had lost 62% of their working-age men and half their horses. Sowed land in the Soviet Union had dropped from 117 million to 84 million hectares. Given the lack of manpower and less land being farmed, of course a famine was due. The Soviet Union engaged in minor relief, but nothing of note. The Soviet Union, unlike the Tsar, would take far more action in relieving famines. Both of these famines are great examples of this. The Soviet government, in this, cared far more for the people than the Tsar did. Finally, we must discuss the Holodomor, also known as the Famine of 1932. I can do no justice in this video to this horrific atrocity. The Holodomor was a famine in Ukraine caused by the Soviet Union and resulted in 5 million deaths. Many historians claim the Holodomor was a planned extermination of the Ukrainian people, who the Soviet government saw as a nationalist threat. Other historians claim the famine was caused by poor government oversight and poor communication. Whether caused by poor communication and government oversight or a planned extermination, the famine would brutalize the Ukrainian people and was truly an atrocity and a tragedy on the Soviet government. The horrid handling of the Holodomor by the Soviet government is our third great crime of the government and represents one of the great tragedies of the early Soviet Union. Whether planned or not, the Holodomor was a horrific crime and represents a great blot on Soviet history. I have already discussed and critiqued the Tsarist Duma, so let us critique the early USSR's democracy. The early USSR had a decent democratic system, but was quickly circumnavigated under Stalin. Stalin would institute a system of approval voting, where the Communist Party would select a candidate, and that candidate needed to get above a certain number of votes to be elected. While this is a laughable excuse for democracy, it did give the vote to every individual in the Soviet Union, outside of convicts. Under both the Duma and the USSR's early system, community organizing was a great way to force policy through. Though the early USSR was not a democracy and had very few democratic systems, it would only improve after Stalin's death in 1953. Whether it was better than the Duma is a far more difficult question. It is really a question of would you prefer to vote and not have much power in that vote, or would you prefer no vote? While the early USSR had hardly any democracy, this can also be very easily compared to the early Americas. In America, at the beginning, only white men could vote, white propertied men, that is. So while the USSR did not have very many democratic systems, it is very similar to America in the way that it would only improve over the time of its existence. Homelessness has been a large problem in Russia throughout its entire history, and remained largely unaddressed by the Tsars. Under the feudal system of the Tsar, homelessness was not his problem, or the problem of the minor lords who owned that part of Russia. Let's talk about the Soviet solution, Stalinkas, also known as commie blocks. Many think of a gray square when they hear Stalinkas, and this is in a large amount of cases. But this is not because the Soviets could not make things that look nice, or hated things that look nice, but because the USSR was an incredibly poor country with limited resources and had to use them wisely. So when designing public housing, you needed to make it cheap and easy to mass produce. So while looking in, we may see these gray blocks as disgusting and a blight upon the land. They saw the guarantee for heated housing with toilets, showers, and stoves. Indoor toilets and gas stoves being somewhat of a middle-class luxury in Russia at the time, this was very appealing. So, I would grade the Stalinkas as a very good solution to homelessness and the housing crisis of Russia. They provided decent homes for the maximum number of people. There were some discrepancies between the houses of average citizens and those with power, but Soviet officials' houses, which were slightly larger, are nothing as compared to the palaces of the Tsar and his officials. When discussing corruption in the USSR, we cannot compare to the monarch, who by his nature was corrupt, as a monarch's coffers are the people's coffers, and there is no separation. We must then compare to other nations that are comparable. Let's start with the US. The difference between corruption in the USSR and corruption in the US, or other developed nations, is the permutation of corruption. It was difficult to find a Soviet official who wasn't taking bribes of some kind. From the heads of restaurants to the smallest border guards, there was money, food, and power changing hands at all times. The USSR was an incredibly corrupt nation. But even under all this corruption, the government still ran and people still lived. So while bribes passed hands, the government still provided subsidized food and housing to the people. Once more, we are looking at two things that are rather different. Corruption in the USSR was incredibly common, but mostly minor, while corruption in the US or other developed nations was often major and involved massive bribes of high-ranking officials to pass legislature or to not regulate big business. The USSR was then, in my opinion, successful, but I am not saying it is better than any other European nation. It was not worse, is my main point. The USSR was a decent nation full of decent people with some decent policies, especially in relation to women, where the USSR excelled as compared to its European neighbors. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day. If you think I am a fool or have made an error, please tell me in the comments. That's all, and goodbye for now.